A public funeral service is currently underway in Troy, Alabama, the hometown of Congressman and civil rights icon John Lewis. Today's service marks the beginning of a 6-day celebration of his extraordinary life and legacy. Monday, Congressman John Lewis will lie in the state capitol at the U.S. Capitol, but first, tomorrow morning, Lewis will cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge for the last time in a special procession. The same site where he and hundreds of other protesters were brutally beaten during a peaceful march from Selma to Montgomery over 50 years ago. Joining me now is MSNBC political analyst John Meacham, and author of the upcoming book, His Truth is Marching On, John Lewis and the Power of Hope, MSNBC legal analyst Maya Wiley, social justice activist Mark Thompson, Errin Haines, editor-at-large at the 19th, and MSNBC political contributor Jason Johnson. Thank you guys for joining me for this very somber block. Errin, I have to start with you, and I hope you don't mind me revealing some of our private conversations, but Errin and I are both daughters of Atlanta, and we've been watching this coverage and talking and tweeting, and one thing we always said is we want to hear from folks from Atlanta, from Alabama, from the black southern belt of this country to talk about John Lewis, and so I can't think of anybody better to start this conversation out with me than you, Errin, and I'm so happy you're here. I want to ask you, as a daughter of Atlanta, what John Lewis's leadership meant for the city, not just the city, but really the state, but Atlanta specifically, because you and I have talked about how magical that place is, being a black-run city at every level, at the state level, at the local level, the influence that black voters from Atlanta have had on the politics there. What are you feeling as we lay this man to rest?
It's good to be with you, and it is frankly very comforting to see that Congressman Lewis is getting the homegoing that he deserves, and that we weren't sure that he was going to get, frankly, in the midst of a pandemic, right? But here you have him making multiple stops across the country, really, so that millions of Americans can give him the proper goodbye that he has certainly earned. The homegoing here today in Troy, Alabama, his hometown. We do try to take ownership of Congressman Lewis in Atlanta. His constituents of the 5th District have certainly known no other representative since 1983, and so we do feel like in a lot of ways that he is ours, and he was a big part of kind of what a lot of us talk about when we talk about the Atlanta way, Errin, right?
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I promise I'll come back to you, but I do want to go to Henry Grant Lewis. John Lewis's brother is telling a story about him right now. Let's listen in.
After the event was over, we was together, and I asked him, I said, John, what were you thinking when you gave me the thumbs up? He said, I was thinking this was a long ways from the cotton fields of Alabama. And those are the memories that I have with my brother. We would have these late night conversations and early morning conversations where he would call me 11, 12 o'clock at night, and he'll ask me, are you asleep? And I say, no, I'm not asleep, John. But actually, I was asleep. And he'll say, have you heard from Freddie or Bibby lately? I said, yes, talked to him a few days ago. Well, I think I'll call him. I said, don't call him tonight. Call him tomorrow. I said, because it's late. But that's the John Lewis that we grew to love, and our family natural will miss him. But he was at peace. He was at peace, and he was ready to meet the Lord. Thank you. I'm standing right here.
Okay, that was Henry Grant Lewis, John Lewis's brother. He had many surviving siblings. Errin, I'm so sorry that I had to interrupt you, but I do want to allow you to finish your thoughts as we lay him to rest.
And listen, certainly don't apologize for letting John Lewis's brother speak there. No, I was saying that Congressman Lewis really was a part of the kind of black political machine in Atlanta that did ensure, that the city has had an unbroken line of black mayors, 6 in a row since, 1973. And so, Congressman Lewis's passing, that generation passing, obviously that means so much for the country, but it also means a lot, for the city of Atlanta, as, folks of his influence and stature are passing from the scene and really, really calling on those of us who are left behind to talk about how that legacy is going to be maintained in their absence. And I think that's already something that folks are seeing. But certainly it's something that has taken on a new sense of urgency with the congressman's passing.
I couldn't agree more. Right now, that is Rosa May Tyner, the congressman's sister, speaking. I just want to listen in for a sec to see what she says.
That's Trevor. He reminded us that it was good Trevor, necessary as Trevor. See something, say something, do something. Thank you.
Okay. All right. I want to bring in my friend, Dr. Jason Johnson, in this conversation. Jason, like you and I have both lived in Atlanta before, so you're not quite a son of Georgia, but you've spent significant time there. Looking at this passing of the torch, I say that Congressman John Lewis was a torch bearer, and in this moment, it feels like he's passing the torch. What do you think his death will mean for the city of Atlanta and really the country?
And Tiffany, this is a really, really key question because, again, yes, I'm not a son of Atlanta. I'm more like a play cousin of Atlanta. But even at the time that I lived there, what you recognize is that people really cared about having a living hero there. People really cared about having an individual who hadn't sold out, who hadn't lost his passion, who still remained committed. So many of that generation, not only have we lost them, which has been sad, whether it's Julian Bond or C.T. Vivian, not only have we lost them, but many of them, they sort of moved off into the sunset and they were distant from people. John Lewis was everywhere. I don't know. I mean, Kim Kardashian might be the only person who was in more Instagram photos than John Lewis after he passed. He meant so much to so many people in that city. And so his loss is going to be really hard for people to get over. And I think Nikema Williams is a fantastic replacement. She's a wonderful, meaningful politician, and I think she will continue with John Lewis's legacy. But those are huge shoes to fill, and there's going to be an extended case of mourning in that city for such a magnificent man, both personally, policy-wise, and politically.
I should just say Nikema Williams is who Democrats have selected to replace him in his remaining term, and she will be on the ballot in November and likely to fill his seat in the heavily Democratic-populated city of Atlanta. She's also a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. I know that matters to a lot of folks out there, so I wanted to mention that. John Meacham, I have to go to you. You have a very well-timed book that's coming out next month, and I think something for me, when I see the footage of Congressman Lewis on that bridge and look at him squaring off with law enforcement officers, suffering a skull fracture in the process. And then I look at footage today of a president dropping smoke bombs to clear protesters in front of the White House. The parallels are striking. It creates for me what feels like a wrinkle in time. So as a historian who spent time with him and studied his life, what do you make of this moment in history that we're witnessing a baton torch, a torch pass, as I've called it?
Yes, I wonder if it's so much a parallel, but tragically, I wonder if it's more of a continuum, that there are iterations of our worst selves that continue to be part of our national experience. And one of the reasons we are honored to honor Congressman Lewis today is because he was a leader of the forces of good, the forces of light. And there's nothing sentimental about what I'm saying. It might be if you were saying it about anyone else but John Robert Lewis. But the man who's lying there in Troy is the man who came out of Troy with an intuitive sense of right and wrong. It was instinctive. He grew up in a part of Pike County called Carter's Quarters, named after his family, and his great-grandfather, Frank Carter, was born in slavery. And so this was, Mr. Carter lived until, I think, John was 8 or 9. So slavery was not an abstraction to John Lewis. He would go into Troy, into town, and see the Jim Crow signs. And he had an instinctive revulsion to it. When he was about 10, an uncle, Otis Carter, took him to Buffalo to see some relatives. And it was like walking into a movie, he said, because here were black people and white people in the same place. They lived next door to each other. They lived out their lives in the stores and downtown and the soda fountains together. And those were the experiences that he had that became informed by what no conversation about John Lewis is complete without pointing out that he believed fundamentally in the gospel of Jesus Christ. He believed that the world could be brought closer into harmony with what the New Testament called the kingdom of God, what Martin Luther King and he called the beloved community, and that if all of us could get our dispositions of heart and mind in the right place, justice could come down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. And that may sound like a lying in state homily or a Sunday school lesson. It was an ambient, tangible, daily reality for John Lewis. And it's what kept him going into those, actually, to be clear, he didn't walk into the state troopers and the posse men at the Pettus Bridge.
Right.
They came at him.
Right.
Let's remember that, right? And that is a moment out of the Bible. Those are Hosea Williams and John Lewis and Amelia Boynton and Charles Malden, and Andy Young was running things from back at Brown Chapel. These were martyrs and saints for the faith. And they walked and walk among us, and they inspire and they illuminate. And what we're seeing, to go back to your question, what we're seeing anew is that we are summoned once again to use those lessons to try to keep pushing, as Dr. King said in the motto of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. That's a plug for Atlanta, since I know we all have to be pro-Atlanta here. I'm from Chattanooga, so I was just over the state line.
You're a neighbor.
So
you're right up the road.
I hope you'll smuggle me through customs. The SCLC motto was, "We're going to redeem the soul of America."
That's right.
And that's
right.
what John Lewis lived and died to do.
Let me just let our audience know that's Ethel Mae Tyner, John Lewis's other sister, who is speaking now. Before we go to her, I just want to say I appreciate your point, John Meacham, about the continuum of what we're saying. Actually, let's listen into her for a second to see what she's saying.
When the clouds would come over the sun, he would start singing and preaching. And there's a song he would always start with. There's a dark cloud arising. Let's go home. Let's go home. And he was also afraid of the thunder and lightning. But he stood by. He always was a fighter. And you know, now when I look at all of the accolades, the pictures that I see all the time, and I think about where he came from. Umber means umber, always. And you know, and don't want to mention all of his accolades, because you all already know them. You all know these. You already know it. But he came from a humble beginning, always humble and respectful to others. So to my brother, Robert, this is not a goodbye. It's just a different kind of hello. And you know, when we talk, he always say, how you doing? And he had this, I'm well. So rest well, Robert. Rest well. Thank you.
That was John Lewis's sister speaking. Mark Thompson, I want to turn to you on this. I think what John Meacham talked about reflected on the role of the Black church, really, that the role that they play in the civil rights era. What role do you see the church playing now? I think as we come into new activists, you were someone who stood on stage with Congressman Lewis. You stood on stage with him as he commemorated Bloody Sunday. You knew him well. You're a son of the civil rights movement, and so you know how steeped in the Black church we are. What role do you see the church playing now, and what does his death mean to you as we usher in this new era of activism?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me, Tiffany. You know, it means a lot, and I think that the church, as I believe it is doing, must rise to the occasion as it did during the civil rights movement itself through the SCLC, who John worked with closely as a part of SNCC. And it's really interesting that this would all be taking place today. John is a historian, but let me just share a couple of things. John Lewis was a Black Lives Matter activist before Black Lives Matter was a hashtag. Today is the 79th birthday of Emmett Till. And most of us believe that the modern civil rights movement kicked off after the death of Emmett Till. If Emmett Till had lived, he would be a year younger than John Lewis, who we are memorializing today. And when that movement kicked off, John stepped out there with SNCC. He became a freedom writer. And then there was Selma. And it's no longer metaphorical. It's history repeats itself, so we're really looking at parallels. And so in this moment when the church and when the younger generation looks at what's going on and it seems so overwhelming, we went from Ahmaud Arbery to Breonna Taylor to George Floyd. That's what was going on in 1965. February 4th, 1965, Malcolm X stands with John Lewis and SNCC in Selma, and then he dies 17 days later. February 15th, 1965, C.T. Vivian is beaten in that famous video by Sheriff Jim Clark, Black Lives Matter, law enforcement. And then February 18th, 1965, Jimmy Lee Jackson is killed as George Wallace is enforcing a moratorium on and prohibition of nighttime demonstrations. What's going on in Portland right now by a president who is literally mimicking George Wallace and fancying himself after George Wallace. After that, this was the plan, and this was what will happen tomorrow with John's remains going over the bridge. The plan was to march Jimmy Lee Jackson's casket from Selma to Montgomery. That was the original plan, and then that plan gave way to what happened on March 7th, 1965, and John Lewis and Hosea Williams leading that march. So that was a Black Lives Matter march in memory of Jimmy Lee Jackson. Jimmy Lee Jackson giving his life for voting rights in Selma, Alabama, and to stand up against a fascist governor in the person of George Wallace. So as we talk about this, I believe the church has a duty, and I think it's taking on that responsibility to draw those parallels, to see how history is repeating itself. We can never stop. And I think the generation that John Lewis has bequeathed his legacy to is doing the same thing and will do the same thing. And let me just say one other thing. We'll see all the wonderful ceremonies over the course of the week. But we'll also see people there who are, to this day, still enemies of John Lewis. If you don't pass a new Voting Rights Act, you're an enemy of John Lewis. If you're not going to release the money for states to come up to speed to have proper mail-in balloting by November, you're an enemy of John Lewis. And it's also very timely that we are literally tomorrow, when he goes across that bridge, tomorrow will be 100 days from the election.
That's right.
John is right. In our faith, we believe our ancestors walk with us, and I believe John Lewis is still with us.
Thank you for that, Mark. Something interesting that you bring up, though, I think is a good point. I want to go to Maya Wiley on this. So John Meacham, our historian on the panel today, talked about John Lewis's lineage, but I want to just remind folks also that John Lewis's great-great-grandfather, after Reconstruction, at his first opportunity, registered to vote. And this is something that the great historian Henry Louis Gates uncovered. Between John Lewis's great-great-grandfather and John Lewis, no one in that lineage had voted but those two men. And Henry Louis Gates tells this beautiful story about when he told him that Congressman Lewis just broke down in tears and said, "I guess it's just in my blood." As we prepare to continue to fight this battle over voting rights, what does his death mean for you, Maya, as someone who is also from a lineage of people who fought so hard to vote, but also the hypocrisy that we've seen some people share their thoughts and tweet out these responses? Even the Republican governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, tweeted out a response, thanking John Lewis for a life well lived in his service as he actively suppresses votes. What do you make of this landscape as we lay this man to rest but continue to wage a battle in his name?
You know, John Lewis used to say, you have to make a way when there's no way. And he never stopped doing that in his life, whether starting in Rock Hill, South Carolina, where he stepped into a beating by trying to get the enforcement of a Supreme Court decision that said you can't segregate public transportation and accommodations. He did that as the youngest freedom rider in 1961. But he didn't stop trying to make a way on voting rights, as Mark has said. It's a shame that in this country, and I mean a shame and a scandal, that John Lewis, in his later years, was still fighting for basic voting rights for people who are black, people who are Latino, people who are elderly, people who are students, because we've seen, as a result of the rapid expansion of black voting, particularly in 2008, particularly to vote for Barack Obama, that the response from the Republican Party was to organize voter suppression and to do it in a way that was exactly the kind of thing John Lewis was fighting, which was to hide the fact that you're trying to prevent black people or Latinos from voting by just making it really hard, knowing that it'll make it harder for voters. So today we fast forward, and he was trying, as Mark said, to get legislation through to correct the tremendous injustice of a Supreme Court decision that decided to look past the growing voter suppression that we were even hearing Republicans say out loud were to keep black people from voting. And just recently we had Donald Trump's own campaign operative say that Republicans had been responsible for voter suppression, admit that. So we can have a public admission from Republicans, and yet they will still try to wrap themselves in the mantle of our constitutional rights to vote. And John Lewis has told us, make a way when there's no way, because black votes matter too.
I love that. I want to go back to John Meacham, our historian on the panel. It's very fitting that tomorrow Alabama state troopers will be carrying Congressman Lewis's body across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which shows in some ways how far we've come, but in many others how far we still have to go. In your book, in the research for your book, we've always heard so much about that day, Bloody Sunday as it's come to be known. In your research for your book, as you came to tell this story, was there anything that you discovered that would be surprising to those of us who thought we may have known everything that happened on that day?
There were three things about Bloody Sunday. One is Reverend Thompson is exactly right. It was in the wake of the Jimmy Lee Jackson murder that James Bevel was a part of that too, in order focusing on how do they press forward in this moment. Selma had been ground zero for so much of this work. So the three things about the march. One was Charles Malden, a young man who was there, remembered the sound of the thwack when the troopers' billy club hit John on the skull. Just remembered the sickening sound of that. And it wasn't, as Maya was saying, Lord knows it wasn't the first time. Bernard Lafayette, the wonderful friend of John's and a fellow freedom writer, said, I don't know what it was, but they always went for John's head. And both he and Diane Nash, who were Nashville colleagues of John, said they were amazed he survived as long as he did, because he was always on the front line. So there was the sound of the thwack. That was one. The other was the full engagement, and this is an important thing to bear in mind, particularly in this moment, the FBI. Right. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI believed the civil rights movement was a communist front, essentially. And the number of agents who were there, the wiretapping, the surveillance state that unfolded, some of the best accounts, most interesting accounts we have of the march are from the FBI agents who were there. And in fact, they went and interviewed John at Good Samaritan Hospital, and the next day recorded his height down to 5 feet 5 inches and a half. So this sort of precision, while never really apparently looking at what they were actually doing by monitoring the movement. The third is at Brown Chapel. John goes in. He says he doesn't remember how he got back. He has the fractured skull. He says if Lyndon Johnson can send to sort of a meeting, Stokely Carmichael described the after-action meeting at Brown Chapel as like a wake in a MASH unit. John says if Lyndon Johnson can send troops to Vietnam, why can't he send troops to Selma, Alabama? And then he begins, he's woozy. He's already thrown up on the bridge, which may have been from the head injury, could have been from the tear gas. He's woozy. They take him to the Parsons house, the parsonage next door. And Worth Long, who had been an Army veteran or a military veteran and a medic, sat him in a high-back chair in the Parsons dining room, and they took him out as if it were a stretcher. They realized they had to keep his head elevated because of the injury. And the troopers, the posse men, there were many sort of deputized folks there under Jim Clark, the sheriff of Dallas County, had ridden their horses up on the steps of the church and really surrounded Brown Chapel and that complex. And it was Worth Long who came out and is reported to have said, using his military vernacular, because he thought it might work with the troopers, we have a man down and I need to get him out. And that parted the way. And he ended up at Good Samaritan. Small details, but it was 55 years ago.
Right.
In America.
Right.
In a nation engaged in what John Kennedy called the long twilight struggle against Soviet communism. The nation that 4 years later would put a man on the moon. The nation that 20 years before had helped defeat the forces of tyranny in Western Europe and in Asia. And so if we don't tell the old story, we can't make our new story.
Right.
Because what's so amazing is John Lewis is a saint. And people may begin to tune out and start to see stained glass and angels. But remember what a saint really is. A saint isn't superhuman. A saint is a human being who's just better than the rest of us.
Right.
A sinner, not a savior. And I believe as firmly as I believe anything about American life and American history, that John Robert Lewis is a saint in that tradition.
And you know, those small details help paint the picture. So I'm very much looking forward to reading your book. You talk about COINTELPRO, the FBI effort to spy. I write about that a little bit in my book as well. So I appreciate you bringing that up. And you also reference Reverend Bernard Lafayette, who will be joining me tomorrow as we commemorate the life of John Lewis as well. So I hope folks will tune in. I do want to bring in Dr. Bernard Ashby, a cardiologist in Miami, Florida, who had the privilege to meet Congressman John Lewis. Doctor, I'd love to hear this story.
Thank you, Tiffany. And thank you for that interview with Bruce Lavelle. I mean, the contrast between him and Congressman Lewis couldn't be any more stark. And I appreciate you calling out the BS. But Congressman Lewis, he impacted me personally, but I mean, he impacted the world. My story begins when I was actually in Congress at I was on the halls of Congress, and I just happened to bump into Congressman Lewis, and myself and my friend, Dr. Alan Lavelle, started talking to him. And during the course of the conversation, he basically, opened up to us and invited us to his office. And it was during that time that he told us stories about Bloody Sunday, about the Civil Rights Movement. And he just so happened to have some pictures from that day. And I heard you guys describe it, but he described it to us in vivid detail of his skull being fractured. And after this conversation, he looked at us and told us that he was in awe of us for what we have done. To me, I can't even talk. That's how taken aback I was, because this is the gentleman that fought for my right to be a physician. And he told me and told my colleague that he was in awe of us. And this white coat that I have here is because of John Lewis. I wouldn't be here if it was not for John Lewis and these other freedom fighters who basically put their lives on the line to fight and rebel for my freedom to be an American. So I will forever be in debt to the civil rights, the folks of the civil rights generation, and everyone that has fought for us. And I just want to make a special point to talk about what's going on in the healthcare system. I feel like it's my mandate to address the healthcare disparities, or the quote unquote racism that's going on in the healthcare industry. And therefore, John Lewis's memory is forever with me. Thank you for giving me a chance to talk about that.
Thank you for talking about it with us. That was beautiful. We are out of time, so thank you, John Meacham, Maya Wiley, Mark Thompson, Errin Haines, Jason Johnson, and the amazing Dr. Bernard Ashby. Memorial services for Congressman Lewis continue tomorrow, when his body will be carried across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma one final time. Be sure to tune in for our coverage with special guests, Ambassador Andrew Young, and someone that may look a bit familiar, my sister friend, Joy Reid. We will begin our coverage at 10 a.m. Eastern Time tomorrow. That's AM Joy for today, and my other good friend, Alex Witt, is up next.